Ambition wasn't just a quality, it was the very atmosphere of Madison Avenue, a pressurized gas of aspiration and cologne that filled every glass-walled office. It was a time of sharp suits and sharper elbows, a decade that celebrated the winner above all else. In this urban jungle, the Sterling and Draper Building was a glittering monument to success, a steel and smoked glass cathedral where deals were worshipped and profit was the one true God. And from his corner office on the 35th floor, Don Sterling was its high priest. His view stretched across the steel canyons of Manhattan, a sprawling kingdom he surveyed daily from a throne of supple black Italian leather. His power was absolute, his name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. On this particular Tuesday in October, however, the kingdom was in disarray. The high priest was dead. Don Sterling was found slumped in that very same leather chair, his head lolled to one side as if in a deep final sleep. A weighty crystal tumbler, clouded with the residue of amber liquid, rested loosely in his cooling hand. Beside it, on the polished expanse of his mahogany desk, stood a half-empty bottle of Glenfiddich Scotch, and next to the bottle, placed with an almost deliberate neatness, was a single sheet of a stark white paper, bearing a few lines of typed text. The note spoke of crushing debts, of catastrophic market failures, of the unbearable shame of a Titan's fall. The first officers on the scene, young men accustomed to the city's more straightforward brutalities, saw a familiar narrative. The locked office, the expensive liquor, the somber confession, it was a classic portrait of a captain going down with his ship. They efficiently ticked the box for suicide, a tragically common story in a city that feasts on success and starves its failures. But when Detective Maria Rossi from the 17th Precinct arrived, she did not see a tragedy. She saw a stage, meticulously set. Rossi was a product of the Bronx, a universe away from this corporate stratosphere. Her shoes were practical, her brown suit was functional, and her gaze had been trained for years to find the lie in a room. She stood in the doorway, letting the scene imprint itself on her senses. She smelled the stale, peaty aroma of the scotch, but beneath it there was something else. Something sterile and sharp, like the ammonia used by the night cleaning crew. The scene was too perfect, too clean. The tumbler in Sterling's hand was barely smudged with fingerprints, held too delicately for a man drinking himself to death. The suicide note was aligned with the edge of the leather desk blotter with a geometrician's precision. Suicides, in Rossi's experience, were acts of desperation. They were messy, chaotic, and final. This felt curated. The medical examiner, a weary, perpetually stooped man named Doctor. Evans knelt by the chair, his movements economical. "No obvious signs of external trauma, Maria," he grunted, gently probing the victim's neck. "Lividity is consistent with the time of death and his position. Looks like he drank himself into oblivion and his heart gave out. Or maybe he helped it along with something from his medicine cabinet. We'll know more after the tox screen." Rossi walked slowly around the desk, her eyes sweeping across the artifacts of a triumphant life. The gold-plated pen set from Tiffany's, the framed photograph of a stiffly smiling wife and 2 children in perfect tennis whites, the gleaming Clio Awards arranged like soldiers on a credenza. Everything was in its place. 2 in its place. "His wife said he never drank scotch, Doc," Rossi said quietly, her voice cutting through the clinical air. "Hated the stuff, said it smelled like a bog. He was a gin man. Beefeater, 2 olives in a frozen glass." Dr. Evans grunted again, a non-committal sound that meant he'd heard her but wasn't changing his report yet. Rossi continued her slow orbit, her instincts humming like the city traffic far below. This wasn't the final messy chapter of a man's life. It felt like a carefully crafted epilogue written by someone else. Ah, the Rolodex. For those who don't remember, this was not simply an address book. In the analog world of 1982, it was a tangible monument to a career, a spinning altar of connections. That little wheel of cards, each one held in place by two precise cardboard notches at the bottom. That was your universe. It was a physical database of power. The right phone number, a direct line to a CEO or a magazine editor, could launch a multi-million-dollar campaign over a single lunch. The wrong one, or a missing one, could mean professional oblivion. Each card represented a handshake, a favor owed, a secret kept, a victory won over a rival. It was a Rolodex of saints and sinners, allies and enemies, and Don Sterling's was legendary. It sat on the corner of his vast desk like a small, powerful idol. Its polished chrome gleamed under the directional halogen lights of the ceiling. It was the source code of his empire. Detective Rossi, having mentally dismissed the suicide theory as a clumsy piece of fiction, focused her attention on this shrine. The other officers were carefully bagging the crystal tumbler and the note, treating them as the primary evidence. Rossi, however, was drawn to the wheel of contacts. It felt more alive, more truthful than the staged scene around it. She ran a finger over the plastic tabs of the alphabet from A to Z. It was a lexicon of New York power. A for American Airlines, C for Cartier, L for the mayor's office. She began to spin it slowly, methodically, not just looking for a name, but trying to read the man's life through his connections. Then she stopped. Her finger rested on the tab for R. She scanned the cards, Renault, Revlon, Richardson, and then Ritz-Carlton. Between the titans of beauty and luxury, there was a conspicuous gap. It wasn't just an empty space where a card might have been temporarily removed for use. Rossi leaned in closer. Her sharp eyes, trained to spot the minuscule and the misplaced, caught the detail that everyone else had missed. The two small metal prongs on the rotating mechanism that held the cards in place were clean, but on one of them, where a card should have been, there was a tiny, almost invisible stress mark on the black plastic of the wheel itself. And next to it, the card for the Ritz-Carlton was canted at a slight, unnatural angle. She gently removed it with her pen tip. There, snagged on the prong beneath, were two infinitesimal flecks of torn beige cardboard. The missing card hadn't been neatly lifted out for a phone call. It had been ripped from the wheel, torn out with force, with anger, with the frantic energy of panic. It was an act of violence in miniature. "Hey, Frankie," she called to her partner, a veteran detective who believed more in gut shots than gut feelings. "Get forensics over here. I want this whole thing bagged and taken to the lab. I want them to analyze these little paper fragments like they're the Dead Sea Scrolls." Frankie glanced over, his expression a mixture of confusion and weary indulgence. "You think someone killed him over a phone number, Rossi?" He looked from the body to the small spinning device on the desk. She looked at the gap in the wheel, a black hole in Don Sterling's otherwise perfect universe. "No," she said, her voice low and certain. "I think someone killed him and then tried to erase themselves from his world. They didn't just want him dead, they wanted to pretend they never existed." This case was no longer about a bottle of scotch. It was about a missing piece of cardboard and the ghost who had torn it away. To understand a dead king, you must speak to his court. Detective Rossi began her methodical journey through Don Sterling's Rolodex, dialing number after number. With each call, each interview, the polished veneer of the victim began to chip away, revealing a colder, harder surface underneath. He wasn't just a sun that other planets orbited, he was a black hole, pulling everyone into his orbit with an inescapable gravitational force, and consuming whatever light they produced for himself. First was Eleanor Vance, his secretary of 15 years. She was a formidable woman with a perfectly coiffed helmet of blonde hair and nerves forged in the crucible of corporate warfare. She sat opposite Rossi in a small, sterile interview room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a portrait of professional grief. "Mr. Sterling was a genius," she stated, her voice steady. "He was demanding, yes, but a true visionary. He saw angles no one else did." When Rossi asked about enemies, Eleanor's mask of composure barely flickered. "In this business, detective, rivals aren't enemies. They're just the competition you haven't beaten yet. Mr. Sterling beat everyone. She claimed to know nothing about a ripped card. The Rolodex, she explained, was his private domain, a sacred text she was not permitted to touch. Rossi pressed, asking about his moods, his habits. Eleanor's loyalty was a fortress, but Rossi detected a hairline crack of fear in her voice when she described his temper. Next was Michael Draper, the junior partner, the handsome, ambitious Draper in Sterling and Draper. He wore his ambition like his tailored Armani suit, perfectly fitted and impossible to ignore. He met Rossi in his own office, which felt like a smaller, less confident version of Sterling's. He spoke of the deceased with a reverence that felt rehearsed, like a eulogy practiced in front of a mirror. Don was my mentor. He took me under his wing, taught me everything I know. But beneath the polished praise, Rossi sensed a powerful current of resentment. The chafing of an heir apparent kept waiting too long in the wings. He was a prince who had grown tired of waiting for the old king to die. Who would have been on that card between Revlon and Ritz? Rossi asked, watching his eyes. Draper shrugged, a gesture a little too casual to be genuine. Could be anyone. A printer, a freelance graphic designer, a research firm. Don had 1,000 contacts. It was impossible to keep track. His eagerness to portray the missing card as insignificant was, to Rossi, profoundly significant. The calls continued, painting a mural of professional carnage. A jilted creative director from a major cosmetics company claimed Sterling had attended a pitch, dismissed their ideas, then repackaged their central concept and sold it to their biggest competitor a month later. A television producer, his voice still thick with a decade-old grudge, swore Sterling had promised him a partnership in a new venture, only to cut him out completely once the financing was secured. A rival from a competing agency, whom Rossi met for a bitter cup of coffee, spoke of Sterling with a toxic cocktail of awe and hatred. The man was a shark, the rival said, stirring his sugar with unnecessary vigor. A brilliant, bloodthirsty shark who could smell a good idea a mile away and would stop at nothing to claim it as his own. I'm not sad he's gone, but I'd never have the guts to do it myself. Everyone had a reason to despise Don Sterling. Everyone had a story of being used, outmaneuvered, or left behind in his glittering wake. They were a chorus of well-dressed, eloquent bitterness. But they all had alibis, solid and confirmed by assistants, wives, and restaurant receipts. Rossi was drowning in motives, but the central clue, the torn card, the ghost in the machine, remained a frustrating, taunting blank. When the polished mahogany doors of Madison Avenue are locked for the night, another unseen city awakens within the steel towers. It is a world of rattling trash bins, the sharp scent of ammonia-scented mops on marble floors, and the quiet, diligent presence of people who see everything and are, by design, seen by no one. Detective Rossi, a firm believer that truth often resides in the margins, knew that if the powerful and polished wouldn't talk, sometimes the overlooked and overworked held the key. Bypassing the executive floor, she headed to the building's cavernous basement to speak with the night cleaning crew and the overnight security guards, the silent witnesses to the building's secrets. The security guard at the front desk, a retired cop named Gus, had a face like a roadmap of the 5 boroughs and an encyclopedic memory for the mundane. He pushed the night sign-in log across the counter. It was pristine, no unauthorized visitors. No one signed in after 7 p.m. except for Mr. Sterling himself, who had arrived at 7:15. He worked late a lot, Gus said, shifting a toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other. A real night owl, but he was always alone. Liked his privacy. Rossi leaned against the counter, adopting a casual conversational tone. Always, Gus? Think hard. Was there ever anyone who came and went without signing in? A regular, maybe? Someone Mr. Sterling might have personally vouched for, told you to just send on up? Gus paused his chewing, his brow furrowing in concentration. He stared at the bank of security monitors, their silent gray images flickering. "You know, now that you mention it, there was one guy. Didn't come often, maybe once a month, always late, never came through the front lobby. Mr. Sterling would call down on the direct line and tell me to let him up the service elevator in the back. Said he was a consultant, a special project." This was it, a flicker of movement in the shadows. "What did he look like?" Rossi asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "Plain," Gus said, shrugging apologetically. "That's the only word for it. Average height, average build. Not a suit and tie guy, that's for sure. Looked more like a college professor or something. Wore this old tweed jacket, even in the summer. Carried a worn-out brown leather satchel, not one of those fancy briefcases. Quiet fella. Kept his head down, never made eye contact." Later, Rossi found the woman from the cleaning crew, a Polish immigrant named Anya, who was responsible for the 35th floor. Her English was halting, fragmented, but her eyes were sharp and observant. In a small break room that smelled of bleach and old coffee, Rossi asked about the man Gus had described. Anya's head bobbed in immediate recognition. "The other man," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "He was here, Monday night. I see him go into Mr. Sterling's office. They talk loud." Rossi leaned in, her voice gentle. "Loud, Anya." "Were they arguing?" Anya nodded vigorously, her eyes wide. "Big argument. Very big. Mr. Sterling," he laughed, a mean laugh, a bad sound. The other man, he was very quiet after that. When he leave, his face, like a storm cloud before the rain. She couldn't remember his name or offer a better description, only the memory of the shabby tweed jacket, the worn leather satchel, and the palpable fury in his silence. A ghost was beginning to take shape. He didn't have a name, but he had a uniform, a temper, and a recent explosive argument with the victim just 24 hours before his death. The typed suicide note was the cornerstone of the entire charade, the single piece of evidence that gave the scene its tragic, misleading narrative. It spoke of financial ruin, of a company on the brink of collapse, of a man broken by failure. If that cornerstone was proven to be a lie, Rossi knew the entire carefully constructed facade would crumble. Accompanied by a forensic accountant from the district attorney's office, she prepared to dive into the cold, hard reality of Sterling and Draper's financial records. It was a world of spreadsheets, ledgers, and balance sheets, but to Rossi it was as revealing as any blood-spattered crime scene. The accountant, a prim, meticulous man named Clark, spread the files across a large table in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room in the DA's office. The numbers, stark and unambiguous, told a story that was the theatrical opposite of the suicide note. Sterling and Draper wasn't failing. It was stratospherically successful. Far from being on the brink of collapse, the agency was in the final, confidential stages of being acquired by Omnicom, a massive international conglomerate. The deal, set to close in less than 2 weeks, was a behemoth. It would have made Don Sterling not just comfortable, but breathtakingly wealthy, a man whose net worth would have been counted in 8 figures. The suicide note was not just a lie, it was a brazen, audacious piece of fiction, a red herring designed to send the investigation down a dead-end street. So, the motive wasn't despair, Rossi mused aloud, staring at the projected earnings. The motive was tied to this sale. Someone was about to get left out in the cold. Clark, warming to the chase, pointed a perfectly manicured finger at another anomaly he'd flagged. "It's right here, Detective. It's subtle, but it's consistent. For the past 5 years, there's been a regular monthly cash withdrawal from a discretionary account. $5,000 on the first of every month, like clockwork." Rossi leaned in, her eyes tracing the column of figures. Who was it paid to? Is there an invoice? Clark shook his head, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with a flicker of professional excitement. "That's the thing. It's not a payment to a vendor. It's a cash withdrawal made by Sterling himself. No invoice, no recipient listed. It's just marked with a 3-word memo. Creative Consulting. $60,000 a year in cash, completely off the books. In the world of high finance, that's a ghost payment. It's money intended to keep someone or something quiet and invisible. The pieces began to click into place with an almost audible snap. $5,000 a month, a consultant who used the service elevator, a man in a tweed jacket and a leather satchel, a fierce argument the night before the murder just as a massive sale was about to close. The puzzle was taking shape. Rossi wasn't just looking for a man who was angry at Don Sterling. She was looking for the man Sterling was paying to be a ghost, the secret source of the agency's success. A ghost who was about to discover that the company he had secretly built was being sold, leaving him with nothing but 5 years of untraceable cash and a future of complete anonymity. The missing card on the Rolodex suddenly felt less like a forgotten contact and more like a severed lifeline, the final, brutal act of being written out of the story. How do you find a ghost? In 1982, it was a daunting task. You couldn't look him up in the phone book under consultant. His name wasn't on any official payroll or tax document. Without credit card trails, cell phone pings, or the vast digital web that would later define human existence, a man paid in cash could truly vanish into the city's anonymous millions. Detective Rossi realized her approach had to shift. She couldn't look for the man himself. She had to look for the traces of his soul, for his work. This consultant was the wellspring of Sterling's genius. His fingerprints wouldn't be on a glass, but they would be all over the company's most celebrated and profitable campaigns. Rossi sequestered herself for 2 days in the Sterling and Draper archives, a stuffy, windowless room in the sub-basement that smelled of old paper, celluloid film, and forgotten ambition. Surrounded by towering shelves of storyboards, binders of print ads, and reels of old commercials, she began to watch and to read. She wasn't an advertising expert, but she had a cop's eye for patterns, for the unique signature that every individual leaves behind. And she found it. She noticed a distinct, almost seismic shift in the agency's creative output that began almost exactly 5 years ago. Before then, the work was competent, professional, but ultimately bland and forgettable. After that point, it became witty, humane, sophisticated, and emotionally resonant. There was a unique voice, a specific kind of intellectual and emotional brilliance that began to shine through in every successful campaign. It was the difference between a competent musician and a virtuoso. Armed with this observation and a portfolio of the agency's best work, she sought out a name from deep within Sterling's Rolodex, a man named Stan Rizzo, a legendary creative director from the 60s and 70s, now retired and living a quiet life in the green suburbs of Connecticut. Rossi drove up to meet him on a crisp autumn afternoon. Stan, a cantankerous but brilliant man with a mind as sharp as a tack, looked over the campaigns Rossi had brought with her. He spread them out on his dining room table, and a sad, knowing smile touched his lips. "This isn't Don Sterling's work," Stan said definitively, tapping a famous storyboard for a transatlantic airline campaign. "Not a chance." Don was a salesman, a predator. He could sell ice to an Eskimo, but he couldn't write a decent line of copy to save his life. He recognized great work, and he knew how to sell it, but he couldn't create it. This is poetry. This is clever and human. This is Arthur Finch's work. Rossi's heart skipped a beat. The name landed with the weight of absolute truth. Arthur Finch? The best pure talent copywriter I ever saw, Stan lamented, his eyes distant. He was just a kid when he started with me in the late 70s. Brilliant, but cripplingly shy. He'd sweat through his shirt during meetings, hated presenting his own ideas. Don Sterling saw his talent, took him under his wing, and then, poof. Finch disappeared from the face of the earth. The story was he couldn't handle the pressure and quit the business to go write a novel or something, but I see now he never left. Sterling just privatized him. He built a cage for his golden goose, kept the genius locked in a back room, and put his own name on the door. Stan didn't have a current address, only a memory of a neighborhood. He was a Queens boy, grew up in Astoria, I think. Always said he preferred it to Manhattan, loved books more than people. A name, a place, a motive crystallized into a heartbreaking story. The ghost in the machine finally had a name. Arthur Finch. The name that should have been on that ripped, discarded piece of cardboard. The journey from the gleaming, self-important towers of Midtown Manhattan to the humble, red-brick apartment buildings of Astoria, Queens, was like traveling to another country, or back in time. Here, the air was not thick with ambition, but with the scent of grilling souvlaki and laundry drying on fire escapes. The streets were quieter, the dreams more modest, the scale more human. Following Stan Rizzo's lead and cross-referencing it with a few old, dusty utility records, Detective Rossi found the building. It was a pre-war walk-up, clean but unremarkable. And there, on a small, tarnished brass mailbox in the vestibule, was the name she was looking for, typed on a small slip of paper. A. Finch. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the worn linoleum. She knocked on the door of apartment 3B. There was a long silence, then the sound of several locks being turned. The door opened to reveal a man in his late 30s, with gentle, intelligent eyes behind thick glasses, and a worn-out gray cardigan that looked like a close relative of the tweed jacket the doorman had described. He was not a monster. He looked like a librarian or a poet, startled by a knock at the door. The apartment behind him was not a den of villainy, but a sanctuary of words. Books were not just on shelves. They were stacked on every surface, forming precarious towers on the floor. Detailed sketches for logos and ad campaigns were pinned to a large corkboard. Notepads filled with elegant, looping handwriting littered a simple wooden desk. This was it, the secret engine room of Sterling and Draper's creative success. "Arthur Finch?" Rossi asked, her voice deliberately gentle. He simply nodded, his face a mask of weary, profound resignation. He didn't seem surprised. It was as if he had been waiting for this knock for 2 days. He knew why she was there. He stepped aside and invited her in. In the small, cluttered kitchen, he made them both a cup of tea with practiced, steady hands. He didn't deny a thing. As they sat at his small kitchen table, he confessed it all in a quiet, melodic voice, as if he were narrating a sad story about a character in one of his books. "He was going to sell the company," Arthur began, staring into his teacup as if the future were written in the leaves. "For 5 years, I created everything for him. The slogans, the concepts. My entire life's work was in that agency's portfolio. He paid me in cash, kept me a secret. He told me it was because I couldn't handle the pressure of the business, but I knew the truth. It was because he wanted all the glory. He wanted to be the sole author." Arthur had seen a small mention of the impending sale in a trade paper and confronted Don on that Monday night. He hadn't gone there for a fight. He had gone there to plead. He didn't want millions. He just wanted what was his. Credit, a small percentage, his name listed as a creative contributor on a few of the key accounts. Acknowledgement. "He laughed at me," Arthur said, his voice finally cracking, the memory a fresh wound. "He told me I was nothing, a nobody he'd invented, a ghostwriter. He said when the company sold, our arrangement was over. I would have nothing, and no one would ever know who I was." The cruelty of the laugh had shattered something inside him. An argument erupted. Arthur, in a blind surge of frustration and despair, shoved Don. It wasn't a killer's blow, just a desperate push. But Sterling, softened by years of luxury and already unsteady from the gin he'd been drinking, stumbled backward. His head hit the sharp, unforgiving corner of the mahogany credenza with a sickening, hollow crack. He went down and didn't move. Arthur panicked. In a fog of terror, he staged the suicide. His creative mind now turned to a darker purpose. He typed the note, placed the foreign scotch in Sterling's hand and locked the door from the inside using a simple trick with a paperclip. As he was about to flee, his eyes fell on the gleaming Rolodex. I had to destroy it. I had to erase myself, just like he was about to erase me. They found Arthur Finch living in a small apartment in Queens, a quiet man surrounded by the brilliant, uncredited architecture of his own mind. The quiet click of the handcuffs in that book-filled room sounded unnaturally loud, a brutal intrusion of reality into a life lived in the imagination. He was not a hardened criminal, but a gentleman who had made one terrible, irreversible mistake, a tragic conclusion to a life of quiet servitude. He had given his talent, his career, his very identity to one man in exchange for a modest monthly payment and the space to create. In the end, all he had wanted was his name on a small 2x4-inch piece of cardboard, a small acknowledgement that he was real, that his work mattered. When that simple human need was denied with a cruel and dismissive laugh, he committed a crime that ensured he would be remembered forever, but for all the wrong reasons. On Madison Avenue, the news of the arrest was a brief, titillating piece of gossip, discussed over 3 martini lunches, and then just as quickly forgotten, supplanted by the next big client, the next hostile takeover, the next firing. Michael Draper got his promotion, ascending to a throne he'd long coveted, though he would find it colder and lonelier than he imagined. Eleanor Vance quietly took early retirement. The Sterling and Draper agency was absorbed by the conglomerate, its name vanishing from the letterhead as completely as Arthur Finch had tried to vanish from the Rolodex. The great grinding machine of ambition and commerce moved on, barely registering the tremor of a life lost and another one ruined. The crime was not solved by ballistics or fibers, but by Rossi's patient decoding of the human heart, by understanding the fragile, desperate nature of the ego. It was a tragedy born not of greed for money, but of a desperate, primal hunger for recognition. In a world built on image and perception, Arthur Finch was the invisible man, the ghost in the machine. The true murder weapon wasn't a shove. It was the years of erasure, the theft of a man's name. In the end, the case was sealed not by a clever alibi, but by a plastic lid. It was a tragic reminder that in a world that so prizes the shiny, perfect surface, the most dangerous and explosive forces are the truths that are hidden just beneath. A life was lost, and a brilliant mind was imprisoned, all for a place in a spinning wheel of cards.